Looking back, there was something unapologetically brash about the Rockstar Games of the early to mid 2000s. They were a different beast than the financial behemoth of today. They were a creative whirlwind, seemingly fueled with an unrelenting desire to push the boundaries of the video game industry and aggressively defend their right to do so. In the years following Manhunt's multitude of controversies, every game and new IP that emerged from their studio seemed like it attracted nothing but the ire and fear of the world's media. Grand Theft Auto as a series has always had persistent embers of controversy underpinning it, but it was Grand Theft Auto San Andreas' hilariously crude sex minigame, dubbed Hot Coffee, that wreaked absolute havoc in 2005. And in 2006, Bully was seen as a vessel to glamorize bullying and school shooting before it was even released, but it did nothing of the sort. If anything, it was staunchly anti-bullying. It even had to undergo a name change to the very catchy Canis Canem Edit in Europe. But in 2007, while Rockstar Games had its fingers firmly in the hornet's nest of controversy, none of its bold children could hold a candle to the reputation Manhunt had garnered in the years removed from its release. You'd have forgiven Rockstar Games for writing Manhunt off as a one-and-done sort of game. An entity, for all of its mechanical and narrative brilliance, had struck a chord a little too close to the bone for many people. But this was the Rockstar Games of the mid-2000s.
You will not remember anything before this moment. Breathe, Daniel, breathe.
Manhunt 2's development began as early as 2004 at Rockstar Vienna. However, when Vienna's studio was closed, Rockstar London took the reins of development. It was a sequel to Manhunt, which was released in 2003, however there was no connection to the events or characters of the first game. Upon unveiling the sequel that caused a collective arse clench in the industry, Rockstar founder and executive producer Sam Houser stated that, "With Manhunt 2, we have tried to create a game that stays as close to the original concept of chilling suspense and stealth, whilst pushing the game design and storytelling forward." Rockstar were not shying away from what made the first game so infamous. The execution system was back, there were a broader range of violent weapons, and the bleak and horrifying tone remained. This time, however, it was under the guise of a more traditional tale of one man's struggle to survive and escape a horrifying asylum. Those arses clenched even tighter when it was announced that the game would be making its way to the Wii, which was the most family-friendly console on the market. The motion controls would be used to mimic the murderer's motions on screen, and people lost their goddamn mind over this.
It's a first-person killer fantasy, described as one of the most violent yet.
The first one was a very violent game. It was completely, kill everything as hard as you can. I mean, there's so many different ways to kill stuff. And this, it just went 10 times more than that.
The PlayStation and Nintendo Wii game is rated mature for intense violence, language, sex, and drug use, which means you have to be 17 to buy it. And the owner of Game Haven says you will be carded. But many parents will be asked to buy it for their kids. So we gave them a first-hand look. Or would you want your 17-year-old to buy it?
No, not really. No, it's too...
You have to take this psycho down, Danny.
It's very graphic.
The Nintendo Wii version is causing the most controversy because you control the actions. Violence in video games is nothing new. The difference is you're actually committing the violence. By doing this, I can hit somebody with a sledgehammer or a knife.
Actions of actually, you have to actually stab the person, so you're doing the same actions that it would take to stab somebody. So, and especially if kids just, get to do that, especially at an early age, I think that it probably would have an effect on them.
So, Rockstar had decided that the finger in the hornet's nest wasn't enough. They pretty much lit it on fire and stuck their entire head in. The game was subsequently banned before release in the UK, and its execution system was hugely censored in order for it to even make the shelves. I could go into the pre-release hoopla of Manhunt 2 in extreme detail, but if you've already watched my Kotaku perspective on the first game, you'll know that I've covered the context of the media's reaction already, so I don't want to bore you with reiterating what you probably already know. So allow me to put Manhunt 2's ghastly reputation aside and jump right into the game itself. For better or worse, Manhunt 2's core gameplay didn't stray too far from the bloody path of its predecessor. The game still predominantly centers around stealth and sticking to the shadows to divide and conquer enemies. The infamous execution system returned, but awkward gunplay once again burst to the fore as the game builds towards its conclusion. Essentially, it still feels like a Manhunt game. That isn't to say that new gameplay features weren't added. My personal favourite addition was the quick-time minigame that occasionally fired up when you're hidden in the shadows and an enemy was getting too close for comfort. It was simple. If you failed to hit the button prompt in time, you'd be detected. In the original game, shadows felt like sanctuary, but the addition of this minigame in Manhunt 2 helped increase the tension in what was once the only remotely safe place to hide. Daniel Lamb, our protagonist in Manhunt 2, is a tad more athletic than James Earl Cash, as he has the wondrous ability to climb walls and crawl. It sounds pretty lackluster, but the two new traversal options really opened up a wealth of level design choices. Moreover, there's a slew of unique environmental executions at your disposal, including jump and gun executions, which really made me pay closer attention to the game world and how best to dispose of my enemies. Actually, the level design and fistfight mechanics are probably the single biggest improvements over the original game. Manhunt was quite a flat experience in terms of level design, seeing as Cash couldn't really interact with the world around him, aside from the murder of course. Yes, you'll still be mainly making your way through dark, depraved areas like the first game, but Manhunt 2's smaller, denser environments, combined with your new traversal skills and environmental execution options, help to make the gameplay a lot less repetitive and works well to bring the best out of the stealth mechanics. The punching mechanics were arguably even clunkier than the shooting in Manhunt, but in Manhunt 2 the fist fighting has been revamped to such an extent that I didn't feel like death was coming every time I had to resort to good old fisticuffs to survive. The only drawback to the new fist fighting is that every punch now staggers you, leaving your jaw wide open to multiple hits from enemies. But just like the original, as soon as Manhunt 2's focus leans more towards gunplay, then that's when my enjoyment dissipated. If anything, Manhunt 2 is even more guilty of this than the original. The earlier levels of Manhunt 2 are genuinely fantastic and feature some of my favourite levels and locations from the entire series. Special mention goes to the Ghosts level, Manhunt 2's second level, which is my personal favourite level in the entire series. It felt like Silent Hill mixed with the best elements of Manhunt: the pulsating soundtrack, the atmosphere, the isolated streets, the claustrophobic interiors, and a well-voiced protagonist slowly unravelling in the ruins of his old home. It was simply a brilliant opening. I was captivated at first and vividly recall thinking I was in for an even more memorable experience than the first game. But annoyingly, those earlier levels are quickly pushed aside in favour of gun-heavy levels for the majority of the game, and annoyingly, the shooting mechanics are not much improved from James Earl Cash's days. It's clear that Rockstar didn't particularly listen when it came to criticisms against the shooting sections of the original. If anything, they tripled down on them. Perhaps even more disappointing is the omission of the point system, which was such a fundamental aspect of the first game. It was obviously removed in the wake of all the scandals surrounding Manhunt 2, as a way of removing any sort of reward scheme for getting the goriest kills possible, and therefore making it seem like Rockstar Games weren't prodding the players to be as violent as possible. An odd side effect of that omission was that there really wasn't any point, narratively or practically, to risk going for an orange or red execution. I mean, a white execution is quick, effective, and not worth any less than the riskier options, so why bother risking it? The filter effect that was added to each execution only wastes more precious time between killing and hiding the evidence. Side note, the sheer amount of different execution animations is pretty mind-boggling from a technical standpoint and deserves an odd sort of praise. Anyway, the execution system worked so well in the original and was so engaging because it worked in tandem with the narrative. Starkweather was driving and manipulating Cash and the player to more depraved kills in order to get the best footage for his snuff film. In Manhunt 2, the execution system is sort of just there. It's shocking, and some of the executions were, and still are, horribly violent, but once that shock factor wears off, they feel somewhat hollow and, dare I say it, pointless. And while I'm being a negative Nancy, there's also an abundance of technical issues and enemy AI cock-ups that can be very frustrating to navigate. The camera is perpetually wonky, as if the camera is attached to a kite during a mild windy day. This is obviously a stylistic choice that I actually personally like, but I can see why some people weren't so keen on it. Plus, the unnerving tension of the first Manhunt has been watered down, considering the fact you can break lights to create shadows and mask your footsteps with the noise of machines, music, or helicopters. These additions aren't a bad thing per se, they can be seen as extra options for expanding the player's creative palette and offer a more dynamic experience. The key difference is that I felt much safer playing as Daniel Lamb than when I played as James Earl Cash. For me, the simplistic gameplay of the original only served to heighten the atmosphere. The streets of Carcer City were a lot less forgiving. So yeah, Manhunt 2 is a mixed bag to play these days. Even with all of those faults, the gameplay is still fun. I feel like my own grievances come from how fond of the first game I was, and still am. After replaying both games back to back recently in preparation for making this video, it's almost remarkable how well the original has aged compared to Manhunt 2. Even with its new features and improved level design, it somehow manages to be less fun for me to play than the original. I think what irks me is that the newer editions weren't used to their fullest potential, and the worst aspect of the original was given even more prominence. The overabundance of shooting levels simply kills the atmosphere of what I reckon a Manhunt game should be. I will, however, defend the earlier levels of Manhunt 2 and argue that they showcase what the sequel should have been. But alas, maybe I'll find some comfort in the game's narrative. The funny thing about Manhunt 2 was that even though I played it a lot more recently than the original game prior to making this video, I could barely recall much regarding the game's plots or its characters apart from a few select missions and the beginning of the story. Therein tells the story of how this game's narrative originally resonated with me, although replaying it in 2019 felt like I was going in with a fresh set of eyes. It's been maybe 10 years since I played it, so the passing of time rendered it easier to individually analyze each component of the game, free from any media bias and free to formulate my own thoughts as a grown-ass man. Go me. Anyway, much like the gameplay, the story is a bit of a mixed bag to play through these days. The game opens up in a suitably creepy asylum called the Dixmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane, and you're quickly introduced to two inmates, Daniel Lamb and Leo Casper, who have bold ambitions to escape this pretty disgusting facility. Daniel Lamb is suffering from a serious bout of amnesia, but with Leo's help he's able to make it back to his old family home and recover drugs to help ease his mind. As you progress, it becomes clear that Daniel has had quite the torrent life, and more than his fair share of buried secrets. The pair are endlessly pursued by bounty hunters and a group called the Project.
Leo? That's right. But we don't have time to reminisce. Getting out was just the beginning, Danny. The Project can't let us live. They can buy a private army if they want to, and they will.
Why did I leave myself these?
It turns out Daniel was a scientist at the Pikmin Project, which was a government-sponsored program set on mastering brainwashing and mind control techniques. The project developed the Pikmin Bridge, a brain implant that contained the mind of a ruthless killer that can be switched on at any time. It essentially bridges the gap between the right and left hemisphere of the person receiving it. The recipient of such an implant wouldn't even be aware of this other murderous mind in their skull, and if the killer was activated, the subject would have no memory of any misdemeanor or crime they committed whilst under the influence of this other mind. Essentially the plot of Zoolander.
But why male models?
You serious?
Lamb eventually seeks help from one of his former co-workers, Dr. White, and after being sedated, White explains the horrid truth behind Lamb's mental struggles. 6 years previously, Lamb had volunteered to be implanted with the Pikmin Bridge in order to earn money to pay off his family's outstanding debt.
What do you mean you volunteered for an experiment? You can't play God with your own mind.
We've tested it. It's safe. It's just the final part of the process.
You're gambling with your life. What about me and the kids?
Look, if it's a success, we can clear all our debts and start a new life.
Turning yourself into a psycho? What are you thinking?
This is a real chance to change the course of medical history.
Stop fighting!
What's wrong, Mom?
Come here, honey.
Son, we still love each other.
You're asking too much of us, Danny. Of yourself.
What does psycho mean?
It just means someone who thinks differently.
Can't you see that you have to put your family first?
I am putting them first. If this all works out, we'll be providing for our great-grandchildren.
This is so wrong, Danny.
Project Danny, they're
His
everywhere.
conditioning is fractured. He's unstable.
Daddy, what's wrong?
You can wake up now, Daddy.
However, rather unsurprisingly, when you get people to stick something in your brain, something went terribly wrong after it was installed, and it led to Daniel suffering from dissociative identity disorder, and ultimately being able to chat with the ruthless killer that was supposed to be locked away. Even more worryingly, Lamb personifies his assassin alter ego and sees him as a real person, that person being your partner in crime, Leo. Essentially the plot of Fight Club. Moreover, Leo harbours ambitions of being the one soul mind in the body he shares with Daniel. In order to fulfill this goal, Leo went on a rampage throughout the city, murdering cops, project members, destroying all the evidence of the implant procedure, before making his way to the Lamb household and brutally murdering Daniel's wife. Leo did this, all hoping to destroy Daniel's grip on reality, and therefore allowing him to eradicate his mind. It's pretty dark stuff. However, before Leo's plan comes to fruition, the projects show up and begin the mother of all cover-up operations. Daniel's memory is erased, his house burned to the ground, and he is then brought to Dixmoor, where he's been studied like an old rat so the project can understand where the implant went wrong and how to fix it.
You can talk to Leo anytime you want, Danny. But first, let's you and I talk.
What's going on?
Do you remember who you were, Danny?
No.
Do you remember the work we did?
No.
You believed we could take a normal individual and implant a second personality, triggered at will. Our intention was to create the perfect weapon, a killer with no conscience or memory. Does he sound familiar, Danny?
Leo.
Two minds in one body unaware of each other.
Wait, that's not right. Leo and I talk all the time.
The bridge malfunctioned early on. We were working to repair the damage when you, or Leo, decided to escape.
I see. How do we fix this?
Hickman thought his mercenaries could destroy Leo. I believe the only person who can stop him is you.
Eventually, the game reaches its climax when Daniel's put in a deep hypnotic state and confronts Leo in the deep recesses of his mind. Kind of like the finale to The Matrix. Daniel is finally able to rid himself of the guilt that's weighed so heavily on his soul in the wake of his wife's death. This unclenching of pain and remorse allows Daniel to exorcise the demon of Leo.
Can never
My name is Daniel Lamb.
My name is Daniel Lamb!
My name is...
Afterwards, Daniel wakes up once again confused with a freshly wiped memory and a mysterious envelope. Inside the envelope is a letter informing him that his name is David Joyner and that his new home is waiting for him. Daniel then walks off into the night. Side note, there is also an alternative ending that takes place from Leo's perspective of the mental war between him and Daniel. It's a pretty cool little ending that sees you wake up as Leo having successfully taken full control of Daniel's body. So that's the story of Manhunt 2 in as succinct a summary as I can muster personally. The very first thing I must mention is that every technical aspect involved in telling Manhunt 2's story is done fantastically well, even by today's lofty standards. The sound design of each level and the direction and voice acting of each cutscene is honestly brilliant. Pavemli Shlolkum Ptolemy Slocum's performance as Daniel Lamb was engaging, and Holter Graham's performance as Leo was as scene-stealing as any time the wonderfully warped Starkweather barked down orders in the original game.
Daniel, please untie me.
Danny isn't here.
But I feel like the two genuinely intriguing and well-realised protagonists are two brilliant characters stuck in a predictable, bland plot. You can't help but figure out exactly where the story is going quite early on in the game, as it's rather apparent from the get-go just what Leo's role is. There was so much more potential in the dual personality aspect of the story, but the plot didn't give these conflicting personalities too many opportunities to truly shine or surprise. The story of Daniel Lamb is one of psychological horror, depression and mental suppression, and Leo is one of violence and humanity running amok without a conscience in tow. But as I discussed in the gameplay chapter of this video, the majority of the game's levels require a run and gun approach, which I feel is counterintuitive to the intimate story Rockstar London were trying to tell with this game. The juxtaposition between the fragile Daniel in cutscenes and the murdering machine Daniel in gameplay lessened the impact of the story for me. I would have greatly appreciated different or exclusive execution animations for each of the protagonists, and it could have really helped define the difference between the two personalities. Daniel's executions could have been more nervous and clumsy, while Leo's could have been more clinical and ruthless. And that's the true killer for me, the lack of connection between the gameplay and story. The original Manhunt was indeed a highly provocative title, but once you peel back the media frenzy, there was a biting social commentary at its core, and the gameplay went hand in hand with the message it was trying to parlay. James Earl Cash was a criminal who found himself forced into the most horrible reality TV show of all time. But it was for a snuff film, and all the snuff film fans' perverse desires. It wasn't really the senseless violence the media hyped it up to be. There was a tangible reason for all the brutality. Cash was forced to kill for his own survival. The brilliance of Manhunt came from the fact it turned the spotlight onto the player themselves, making me question my own enjoyment from seeing such gory executions on my screen. While Manhunt 2 touches on some profane themes, like its references to the real-life MK Ultra mind control project developed by the CIA, you should really check that out, it's a pretty demented story. It plays out much more like a generic action narrative. The story is not interwoven with gameplay in the manner the original game was, and the game is worse off because of it. Essentially, I believe you could have told this story without the framework of Manhunt's mechanics, and nothing would have been lost in the transition. The Manhunt series has a legacy as unparalleled and as divisive as any in the video game industry. The games have been somewhat banished to the past, and when I see them discussed, I feel as if they're routinely disregarded as vessels of mindless violence and not much else. And for me, that is a great shame. I stand by my remarks in my Manhunt Attack perspective that the original is a masterclass of suspense, tension and horror. But I find Manhunt 2 a little more difficult to define with the same reverence. It's a good game, with some great moments, but when tackling the themes of violence, mental illness and human depravity, being good is not good enough. You need to be great throughout. That's the primary difference in the legacy of the respective games. Manhunt was truly great and was laser focused with gameplay that perfectly served its narrative. Manhunt 2 seems almost unfocused in comparison in how it handles and portrays the violence on screen and what the player's role in that violence is. It lacks the cohesion and subtext in its narrative that the original had, but perhaps even more damningly, Manhunt 2 feels like the game the original was unfairly criticised for being, a parade of ultra-violence that ultimately didn't have so much to say for itself. It was the last game developed by Rockstar using the legendary renderware engine, and even in 2007 it seemed somewhat like a relic of the past. When I compare it to games released the very same year like Mass Effect, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, God of War 2 and Bioshock, it simply doesn't hold its own against them. Manhunt 2 seemed like one last fuck you out the door for Rockstar Games as it left the console generation behind them that had made the company what it is today. However, I will say this, Manhunt 2 was a bold experiment and was brave enough to try something new and not rely on the setting or characters of the original. But more importantly, it stands as a symbol of standing up for your art, no matter how unsettling or shocking it might be. It still made me think about what I was doing while playing the game, and that alone is a hell of a lot more than most games manage. It's been 12 years since a Manhunt game last hit or was taken from store shelves. 12 long years in which the video game industry has grown and changed exponentially. Games are more realistic than ever, they're bigger than ever, they're more mature than ever, and they generate more revenue than ever. And that's why I firmly believe that we will never see a Manhunt 3. And don't get me wrong, I would love for it to happen a la Max Payne 3, which was the last time Rockstar Games dusted off one of its older, more niche franchises and brought it back delightfully well. But Manhunt just doesn't feel like a viable game series anymore. My two arguments for this would be, one, who would Rockstar Games be making this game for exactly? And two, do you unleash a third Manhunt game into a hypersensitive world, or do you remove all of the controversial characteristics or themes that made Manhunt what it was? To revisit the series would mean Rockstar once again awakening the dormant beast of media backlash and potentially facing multiple court battles just to get the game released in certain countries. It would be a huge financial and creative risk that might serve only to drudge up all the controversy Rockstar spent over a decade working tirelessly to move beyond. Make no mistake about it, even though the games industry has come on leaps and bounds over the past decade, a Manhunt game powered by the graphics and physics possible with today's consoles would result in an absolute media shitstorm. So why bother? Rockstar aren't the grungy punk band playing in dive bars to a core group of loyal fans anymore. They're the Rolling Stones selling out stadiums. They don't need the controversy, and I really reckon they don't chase it like they used to. They've got their shark cards and their gold bars. That's the sad reality of the modern day Rockstar. They're not the same company they were back in the mid-2000s. But at the same time, maybe when you take all of what I just said into account, it's the perfect time to drop Manhunt into the world. Think about it. The fast development of social media and live streaming would be ripe for the taking in the context of a Manhunt game. If anything, it would be a natural evolution of the original game's narrative and its commentary on reality TV at the time. Maybe in the future, Rockstar might find the urge of being a maverick with something to say about the state of society, too strong to resist. Who knows? Thanks for watching.